Welcome to this tutorial on working with multiple XAML files inside of UiPath Studio. We will continue with the same approach that we've taken to date by simply going into a new project by a process. We give ourselves a blank process to work with, so go ahead and open this guy up. And we will call this one Multiple XAML Files. I want to stay with the same path that I've been working with. I'll say working with multiple XAML files. Passing parameters and arguments between multiple XAML files. That's a bit more in depth and detail what it is we're going to be doing. We're going to learn what parameters and arguments are and how they function inside of UiPath Studio. So go ahead and hit create here, and we'll get this process underway. The reason why this is an extremely important topic inside of UiPath Studio really comes into play when we get deep into the trenches of the ReFramework, which is going to be coming up in a future lesson, as well as when we get into the later projects that we will be working on. When we get into ReFramework, we are going to be working with multiple XAML files all the time, quite extensively. And the problem is when you deal with multiple XAML files, the variables that we define and declare inside of one XAML file, unfortunately, are not known to another XAML file unless you pass them or connect them via what we call arguments. So to demonstrate how this capability and functions and works inside UiPath Studio, we're going to do a mini exercise here, playing around with what I call a calculator type app. So what we're going to do is go back to our old trusty int number 1, int number 2 approach, add those two numbers together inside of a second XAML file and return the results back to the original XAML file on which where we will present the final results to the user. So in order to do this, let's go ahead and get into our main workflow. And let's bring in a multiple assign activity. Go multiple assign, drag this in. We want to add 2 lines here, and then you heard me mention just a moment ago, we want to bring in 2 new variables, int number 1 as an integer, and on the other side, int number 2 also as integer. So int number 1, we will give a value of 4. Int number 2, and give it a value of 2. So at this point, we know we can do a simple and basic calculation, 4 plus 2, obviously being 6, and then do the final output. So we could do something like this. This is what we've done to this point in time. So being able to do a right line here, you know that we can do a int number 1 plus int number 2. Obviously, this is expecting a string. So I'll wrap this in and say to string, and if I run my automation here, you'll notice I'll get a value of 6 to display. Unfortunately, but fortunately, this was easy to do, but it defeats the purpose of the exercise that we're trying to conduct here of understanding how do we pass the 4 and 2 into another XAML file, which, like I said, will make a lot more sense when we get deep into working with ReFramework. But let's start with something small, something basic and simple here that we're able to clearly see all the connection points of how do we pass arguments back and forth. So first things first, we obviously need a new XAML file. So this is going to be a new task that we have not done to this moment in time. So I need to go back to the project tab. And at this rate, we're going to keep it simple. We're going to put the new XAML file right next to main XAML file. When we get into ReFramework again, kind of future forecast for where we're going, we're actually going to want to create those new XAML files inside of subfolders inside of our project so we can start grouping like XAML files together more specific around the nature of the work or the system that they're automating against, where those files are being kept, trying to keep things a bit more organized. In this case, we're talking one XAML file purely from a demonstration perspective. So keeping it right in line with main is going to be appropriate here. So to create a new XAML file, I'm going to come down here in this white space down below and do a right click and say add. In this case, I'm going to go new sequence. Recall we talked about flowcharts back when we were dealing with if statements or selection decision structure activity. Well, we'll get into state machines when we start talking about ReFramework, so hold on to that. But in this case, let's just simply create another blank sequence here. When you do this, this box should look very familiar. This is similar to creating a new project. In this case, it's just wanting to know, what do you want to call the new XAML file? In this case, let's call this one calculator. Notice the file path here is going to be the exact as right next to main, and that's because we did the right click in line with main. So that's where this folder structure comes into play. We will not change this. To simply give it the name of calculator and hit create. When you do this, you'll see a couple things happen. Notice it opens the calculator XAML file for us. And then notice next to main, we now have a calculator.xaml file. So it's successfully created our new file. Notice with multiple files that it starts to create kind of a tabbed approach up here. So depending on how many XAML files you have open, each of those individually open files will appear across the top here. So it gives you the easy ability to go back to main, and then obviously back to calculator again. So you're able to kind of tab back and forth between the two. The thing that I want to do here is anytime I create a new XAML file, I always try to get in the practice to go back to where it is I want this XAML file to be, what we call invoked from. Where do you want this new XAML file to begin executing from? And in this case, we only have two files, so calculator needs to be invoked or called from main. So I'm going to go back to main, and I want to do my calculation once I have the two numbers assigned. So right after the multiple assign, and before I do my write line, I want to have my invocation, as you would call it, to the calculator XAML file. And just like we've always done with our activities, I want to now click on the calculator XAML, single click, and then drag as we did our activities and bring it right into our workflow and let it go. And you'll now notice the workflow file name being calculator.xaml. We're going to come back to here in just a minute. Notice this is a nice gray and blue. If I click open workflow, it's going to take me to calculator, so I can either click the button here, or since calculator is already open, I can come back to here. What we're trying to do, again, is to make this calculation to where we get 6, but we want to send the 4 and the 2 into calculator. Recall what I said a minute ago, int number 1 and int number 2 are only known inside of our main XAML. Calculator as a XAML file, as of this very second, as we're looking at it live time on the screen right here, has no idea what int number 1 and int number 2 are. Calculator doesn't have a slightest clue what these two variables are, only main does. So we have to come up with a method or technique of sending int number 1 and int number 2 into calculator. And what we're going to have happen inside calculator is it's going to do the 4 plus 2, int number 1 plus int number 2, similar to what we had in the write line. And then whatever the answer is, we're going to send that answer back out. So obviously the answer is only known inside calculator. We need to be able to return that answer or the result back to main on the other side. So the way this is done inside calculator. We have to go to the calculator XAML. And up to this point in time, we've always focused on the variables tab and creating new variables. We're going to take it a step further now and move into this arguments tab. Arguments are nothing more than a special type of variable that allows for data to pass from one XAML file into another XAML file. In this case, the arguments belonging to calculator will allow any XAML file that calls the calculator app to send data into it. And then obviously on the other side, sending data back out of it. Calculator back to whichever XAML file did the original invocation, whichever one called, the calculator app to execute. So to do this, it's really no different than creating a handful of new variables like we've done, all along to this moment in time. One small little difference with our naming convention here, we use a in underscore or out underscore prefix in these cases with our arguments, just so we know the direction in which these variables are being used. So our first one, we're going to have a in argument. We're bringing data into the calculator XAML file. In this case, it's going to be in, and we'll call it number 1. This is an important little step here. What direction are we sending the data in between the two XAML files? Are we sending data into calculator? Notice we're in calculator, so it's saying into calculator, or we'll eventually get to it. Are we sending data back out, sending data out of calculator to another XAML file, in this case, main? We've got another option that's probably not as commonly used, but this idea of an in-out direction actually allows data to go into and out of calculator from both the calling file as well as the actual, the file in which we're building the arguments inside of, in this case, calculator. So in this case, I want in number 1 to be an input. I want us to take the 1 here in number 1, send it into calculator. So that's where in number 1 or in underscore number 1 is as an in. And I want this to be a integer, since it's an integer on the other side, trying to make sure consistency of how these line up on this side. On the other side, in number 2, following that same sequence, it's inbound. I want data coming into calculator, and say int 32 here as well. And then, as we've talked about, we want to then send the computed results. So obviously up here in our sequence, we're going to have a calculation of int number 1 and int number 2. And then we want the final result to go into another argument. So now I've got too many arguments. I delete this one. Argument 1 here is going to be an outbound. So out underscore, I'm going to call this result or answer. Important, 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 important. Make sure you set your direction to out. If you were to leave this to in, the data will never leave calculator. Kind of acts like a roadblock. Make sure your direction is set correctly. Obviously, if you had an out, it won't let you send data in. So make sure as you're defining your arguments, you're sending the data in the proper direction. And I want this to be int 32. One thing to point out here, which I should have done a moment ago, all the data types that we're accustomed to are all right here. So you can send whatever type of data you want back and forth between the two. In this case, our little example here is kind of boring that we're doing everything as a integer value here. So to demonstrate this, let's hit save. And if I go back to main, you're going to notice something significant has happened and changed. Notice here, our workflow has a orange box on it now. And the reason why is we've created new arguments inside calculator. It's trying to alert us or give us a heads up that we are not connecting all of our arguments right here. So in order to officially connect mains in number one and number two, as well as trying to get results back to calculator, we need to click on this import arguments button. So notice we're back in main again. We're getting the orange box here, which is an alert to us that we need to connect all of our arguments, connect all the variables. So if I click on import arguments, this is the screen that we receive. And the way this screen works, it's a bit tricky. So allow me to try to walk through the detail here. Notice the in number one, in number two, and out result. Recall, these are the arguments that live inside calculator. So the left side here, think of this as the variables inside of, in this case, the arguments inside of the XAML file that we are calling or invoking, the one that we're trying to send data to or get data back out of or from. That's what's on the left side here. Notice the direction. This was everything that we specified inside the invoke, in this case, the calculator, as well as all the data types. The value boxes on the far right, this refers to the data that we are either going to send in or receive back from the file that we just invoked. So obviously all these values here, since it's invoked in main, these values here are going to be either hard-coded values, values that we might be sending in from parameters that we'll get into later on down the road. We call the config file inside ReFramework, or obviously other variables that we already have defined inside of, in this case, the main.xaml file. So the way this works is in number one is a inbound. So it's sending data into, or what I always like to say is from right to left on these inbound directions. So we're going to take the value here and put it inside of in number one, which obviously again is inside of calculator. So for in number one, we want to type in int number one. So in number one, again, coming from main, sending it into, so moving it, the data from right to left, putting int number one's value into the in underscore number one. On the other side, int number two becomes the value for the second one. Take the value of int number two that's inside main again, there's the variable if you look underneath the window here. Send it into in again, right to left, think right to left. Take the value here, put it into our in underscore number two. On the other side, we have out result as outbound, as an out direction, sending data from calculator back to, in this case, main. What I always try to get people to think about in this type of situation is we're going to have data coming from this invoked XAML file back into our current XAML file, in this case, main. We need a spot to catch the result that's coming back to us being main in this case. Where is this value going to be held inside main until we're ready to actually do something with it? Notice we don't have any variables out here for our final result. So we need a new variable. And this is a nice little feature. To a point, you're going to see one little quirky little thing and demonstrate this. We can hit Control K here. Notice I'm in the value box next to out result. If I do a Control K, notice it allows me to create a new variable on the fly here. I need to be able to catch the data coming back from calculator in that out result variable. I'm going to call this one int result. And this variable int result, remember the value is talking about main. It's going to declare a new variable inside of main called int result. Here is the buggy, quirky thing that it would be nice if one of these days UiPath fixes and solves. As soon as I hit enter, you're going to get a little blue box, a little blue error message here telling you that int result is not declared. Notice if you look inside main, int result, it's technically not there. Recall we just did the Control K though. This is a buggy, quirky error problem that UiPath Studio has anytime you create a new variable inside of one of these invoked workflow arguments. This is not actually an error at this point. It is if you look at it legitimately that the variable is currently not defined yet. It's not there. But as soon as I hit OK here, the blue dot's going to go away, and you're going to see int result show up as a variable. So watch closely. Int result is there. Notice my orange has gone away. I have now satisfied all the arguments. Everything is officially connected. I'm able to send int number 1 and int number 2 into calculator. And then on the other side, I'm going to get the result back out and place it in int result to demonstrate that the blue dot is gone. If I click on import arguments again, you'll notice int number 1 and number 2 are still there. Notice the blue dot is now gone on int results. The reason again being int result was officially added to the variable list when I hit the OK button the last time I closed the invoked workflow arguments. So now we have officially established a connection between the variables between these two XAML files. To demonstrate the capability is working, let's go ahead and bring in a couple of write line activities. Notice I went back to calculator, kind of did that quickly. Back in calculator here, I want to see the results of int number 1 and int number 2. Did they make it here? So I'm going to say number in quotes, number 1 is, let's say in underscore number 1. See it, they're treated just like variables. And notice it's got a blue dot error here because it's a number. Write line, remember, is expecting string, so we have to typecast this. So say .to string. Everything's happy. The other side, repeat the same that we just did. Number 2 is, and say in underscore. That's the thing that's important to note about these arguments, is that the arguments are really nothing more than variables. But they're special variables in the sense they allow you to pass data between XAML files. And the error that I'm getting here again is a number needs to be converted to a string. So if I hit save here, a couple things to call out here. Now that we're dealing with multiple XAML files, if I hit the play button here, debug current file, it's only going to run calculator. So if I hit play here, what you're going to see is number 1 and number 2 are both 0. What has happened here is it's looking at number 1 and number 2. It's not coming from main. It's just running. It's debugging and testing just this single XAML file. And the default value for an integer that has not been declared is always going to come in as 0. So that's what we're seeing here. If you want to debug your file to actually see the capabilities working here, I need to go to main. Going into main on this tab, and then if I debug the file, it's going to make the assignments, it's going to invoke the calculator, the variables are going to get passed into the arguments, and obviously we're going to see this write line activity, which we're going to have to clean up here in a minute. Is going to be a bit misleading, but at this rate, go ahead and hit the play button. This is going to be able to demonstrate that we are seeing successful results in calculator. What you'll see here now is number 1 is 4, number 2 is 2. Notice those are not in main. Recall we put those lines in calculator so we know our parameters are successfully working. We have 4 and 2. Now we need to go one step further and do an assign activity inside of our calculator. Notice again, I'm inside calculator. On the assign side, let's do out underscore result. So again, our argument here, we're assigning our calculation right to the argument. Obviously, this is going to be in number 1 plus in number 2. So now we're adding number 1, number 2, and storing the results in out result. So if we save here, go back to main, notice the arguments aren't orange because we did not make any changes there. We simply added new logic to calculator. Let's change our statement here and simply say the computed result from calculator is, and then say int result, and remember that's an integer, so we also have to typecast that again. But we're officially saying there's the string. I'll wait here for just a second, give everybody a moment to get caught up. Say int result to string. Notice that's the argument coming back again from calculator, placing the argument into the variable int result and displaying our answer here. So if I hit save, everything's saved here. Hit run, we should now see the result, the computed result coming back out of calculator and being correctly calculated and displayed. And there we go. 4 and 2 inside of calculator, and then this line here being the right line where we're getting the correct result back being 6. To be able to play maybe a bit more, change the variables around a bit. Let's go 10 and 5. Remember, we're still inside main, so run, so we should get a result of 15. There's the 10. There's the 5 and our calculated result of 15. This concludes the activities required for working with multiple XAML files, how we're able to pass arguments to and from a invoked workflow. And like I said, once we get deeper into the ReFramework, this becomes an extremely important concept. So this is one you may want to potentially revisit and work through maybe a handful more times to where you really feel comfortable as to how the arguments and variables between the two XAML files syncs up.